I didn't expect my wife to ruin our son's graduation party, but she did it with a smile. Right in the middle of my backyard, surrounded by our family, our friends, and our son's classmates, she raised her glass and said, "I have an announcement. I found my soulmate, and it's not my husband." People laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of joke, but the silence that followed was heavy, like the air itself froze. She kept talking, explaining how she'd met someone at a wellness retreat, how they'd connected on a spiritual level, how she couldn't live a lie anymore. And all I could do was stand there, holding my own glass, watching the woman I'd spent 20 years with tear our life apart in front of everyone. My name's Michael Harris, 48 years old. I'm a project manager for a construction firm in Denver. I don't lose my temper. I don't make scenes. My strength has always been staying calm when everything else burns. And that night, while everyone stared at me waiting for a reaction, I just smiled. Then I raised my glass and said, "To the truth. Better late than never." A few people laughed nervously. My wife, Rachel, looked relieved, like she thought I was accepting it. But she didn't know I'd already known. For months, I'd found the messages, the hotel receipts, even the prepaid phone she thought I'd never discover. She was leaving me for a yoga instructor named Caleb, a man who gave spiritual alignment sessions and still lived with his mother. I didn't confront her. I didn't yell or threaten. I planned, quietly, methodically, because if she wanted to embarrass me in public, she needed to learn what real exposure felt like. I had spent weeks preparing for this night. The catering company, the decorations, the music, all perfect. Everyone Rachel cared about was there. Her coworkers, her parents, her soulmate, sitting awkwardly near the punch bowl. I'd even asked my son to give his graduation speech right before dessert to make sure every eye was on us afterward. So when she stood up and dropped her little bombshell, I wasn't blindsided. I was waiting for it, watching her walk right into the trap she didn't even know existed. She thought she was taking her power back. But the truth was, by the time she raised that glass, I'd already taken everything, her story, her secrets, her pride, and wrapped it up in a single, cold reveal that would make her run out screaming before the night was over. And the best part? She wouldn't even see it coming. I didn't react that night, not yet. I let her enjoy the moment, standing there with that self-righteous glow, like she'd just delivered a TED Talk on personal freedom instead of detonating our family. She expected outrage, tears, maybe begging, but all she got was silence. And that silence unnerved her more than anything I could have said. I stayed calm through the awkward applause and the whispers. Our son, Ethan, looked like he'd been punched in the gut. I gave him a reassuring nod, the kind that says, "It's okay, we'll handle this later." He didn't know half of what I knew. Not yet. When the party finally ended and the guests trickled out, Rachel tried to corner me in the kitchen, asking if we could talk like adults. I just nodded and said we would, tomorrow. Then I went upstairs, locked my office door, and reviewed everything one last time. On my desk sat a flash drive labeled June. Inside were copies of emails, text threads, and photos. Nothing explicit, just enough to make her words from that night look like a confession. And that flash drive wasn't my only insurance. A month earlier, when I'd realized the affair was serious, I'd gone quiet. Started documenting everything. Financial records, bank transfers, the private messages between her and her soulmate, planning to use joint savings for a new beginning. I wasn't just preparing for revenge. I was securing my future and Ethan's. I filed everything in a folder named Project Aurora, a small joke for myself. Rachel once said I didn't have any creativity left. Turns out, I just hadn't been inspired yet. By midnight, the house was silent. She was asleep in the guest room, pretending to cry. I poured a drink and sat by the window, watching the reflection of the backyard lights fade. I thought about the years we'd spent building a life together. The house, the savings, the trust. And how easily she'd traded it all for a fantasy with a man who taught breathing exercises for a living. I didn't hate her. Not yet. I was just done. Done explaining myself. Done forgiving. Tomorrow, she'd wake up thinking she'd made the first move. But she'd learned that the real game had already started, and she was already losing. The next morning, she came downstairs dressed like nothing had happened. Hair done, coffee in hand, pretending her announcement was just another step in her journey. She talked about transitioning peacefully, about co-parenting maturely. It was almost impressive how she could burn down our life and still act like she was the reasonable one. I let her talk. Every word was another nail in the coffin she was building for herself. When she finally stopped, I said only one thing. I understand. The same phrase I'd used 1,000 times in meetings when someone thought they were in control. She didn't realize it meant I'd already moved on. From her, from us, from pretending. After she left for her yoga class, I opened the file I'd been building for weeks. The one marked confidential. It wasn't just screenshots and receipts anymore. It was structured, legal, complete. I'd spoken with a quiet, careful attorney named James Porter, a man who'd handled divorces for people who didn't want drama, only results. He'd helped me transfer half of our joint funds into a separate account under my name. Perfectly legal under Colorado's marital preservation statutes. Rachel wouldn't notice until it was too late. By noon, I'd packed a small duffel bag for Ethan, just in case. He was at his friend's house for the weekend, and I didn't want him walking into what was coming. The party had been her stage, but the next act would be mine. That evening, Rachel returned home humming, phone in hand, texting him, "Caleb." She smiled like a teenager, not realizing I could see her reflection in the glass door. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Before bed, I logged into our home security app, the one she'd forgotten I controlled. I scrolled through the feed, camera angles, timestamps, audio logs. Everything she'd said, every call she'd taken in our kitchen while planning her escape, was archived, including one where she told her soulmate she'd convinced me to sign power of attorney forms for the refinance. That recording alone could end her legally. I didn't plan to ruin her. Not yet. I planned to let her ruin herself. My job was just to make sure the right people were watching when she did. And by the look of the calendar reminder blinking on my screen, graduation party, final speech, the stage was perfectly set. 2 days after the party, Rachel moved out. She said she needed clarity, which was her way of saying she wanted to live with Caleb. She left half her clothes, half her guilt, and none of her dignity. Ethan didn't say much about it, but I could see the confusion behind his calm face. He was 18, old enough to see the truth, but still young enough to want to believe his mother had a reason. I didn't tell him the details. Not yet. He'd learn the right parts when the time came. Rachel texted every few hours at first, pretending to coordinate bills and schedules, but I could read between her lines. She was testing my reaction, waiting for me to snap, to beg, to fight. When I didn't, she got quieter. The silence bothered her. It always had. Meanwhile, I met with James again. We sat in his downtown office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He'd reviewed the evidence and told me what I already suspected. She'd forged my signature on the refinance papers 3 months ago. The bank would confirm it once we filed the fraud report. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I told him not yet. Timing mattered more than vengeance. He nodded slowly, said he understood the type of man I was. Quiet, strategic, the kind who plays the long game. That evening, I went home and opened the flash drive again. The party footage had already gone viral among our circle. Someone had filmed her little announcement. I didn't need to share it. It was already doing its job, spreading through whispers, group chats, and office gossip. Her reputation wasn't shattered yet, but it was cracking. Caleb tried to contact me once. Called from a blocked number, probably expecting a confrontation. I didn't pick up. I didn't need to. He'd learned soon enough that Rachel's idea of freedom came with a price tag. Every night, I wrote a few notes in my notebook. Names, dates, steps. Freeze. Track. Respond. The same system I used at work when handling crises. It kept me focused, disciplined. She'd made her move in public. I would answer in silence. And when I finally spoke, it would be in a way she could never undo. By the end of that week, the silence between Rachel and me had turned into something sharp. She wasn't used to being ignored. She'd always controlled the emotional rhythm of our marriage. When we talked, when we fought, when we made up. Now she was trying to draw me back into the pattern, but every time her name appeared on my phone, I let it ring out. I focused on the details. Small, deliberate steps. I visited the bank and met with the fraud investigator, a man named Thompson with tired eyes and a coffee stain on his tie. I showed him my identification, the real signatures, the timestamps. He looked at the paperwork, then at me, and said he'd seen this before. Spouses forging signatures, transferring equity, pretending it was just a misunderstanding. I told him I wasn't interested in misunderstandings. I wanted documentation. 2 days later, he called to confirm it. The refinance was fraudulent. My wife had pulled $30,000 out of the house under my name. And according to the records, Caleb had been listed as a co-applicant. That was the first time I actually smiled in days. Because now, it wasn't just betrayal, it was a crime. I didn't tell her immediately. I let her go about her new life, posting pictures of morning hikes and smoothie bowls, pretending everything was pure and spiritual. People commented with hearts and affirmations, not realizing that behind the filters was a woman about to lose everything. James advised me to be patient. He said timing was leverage, and leverage was everything. He was right. So I waited. Quietly. One night, Ethan came home from his friend's house and asked if I was okay. I said I was. He hesitated, then said his mother had been calling him, asking strange questions, if I'd been angry, if I seemed unstable. I told him not to worry. Just focus on college. The rest wasn't his burden. After he went upstairs, I sat alone in the dark living room. Outside, the streetlights reflected off Rachel's empty parking spot. It was strange how peaceful the house felt now. No tension, no forced small talk, no pretending. Just space. I poured a drink and whispered to the empty room. Almost there. Because the thing about silence is, when it finally breaks, it hits like thunder. The first crack appeared when her soulmate's name showed up in a police report. Caleb had been stopped for driving my old truck, the one still registered in my name. He didn't have insurance or a valid license, and the vehicle was impounded. When the officer ran the plates, they came back under my ownership. The call came to me. That was how I found out he'd been using my truck to drive to his wellness sessions. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even call her. I just forwarded the report to my lawyer. He called me back an hour later and said, almost laughing, "This keeps getting better." Apparently, inside the truck were prescription pads from the dental office where Rachel worked. Her name was on the access logs. That turned it from a domestic mess into something much bigger. Fraud, theft, misuse of controlled materials. That night, she texted me, asking if I'd spoken to the bank. I didn't answer. The next day she called, her voice shaking, saying there were issues with paperwork and that she needed clarification. I stayed silent. Every word she left on voicemail became evidence. Her nervous tone, her half-explanations, her sudden awareness that things were unraveling. Meanwhile, James coordinated with the investigator. They traced the refinance funds to an account partially in her name, partially in Caleb's. Half the money had already been transferred out to someone named Daniel Spencer, a real estate broker known for quick cash sales. That was the missing piece. They weren't just stealing from me. They were planning to sell the house while I was still living in it. The thought made me pause. That was how little I mattered to her now. Just a name on a document she wanted erased. But that mistake, her impatience, was the one thing that gave me control. By the end of the week, James had gathered everything. Forged signatures, transfers, call logs, even Caleb's record. The next step was to involve the authorities, but I wanted her to see it first. Not through yelling or confrontation, but through silence so complete it became unbearable. When you strip everything away from someone who thrives on attention, silence becomes punishment. And she was about to learn what it felt like to disappear from the story she tried to write without me. A week later, I decided it was time to move. Not loudly, not with threats or confrontation. Just quiet, irreversible precision. I drove downtown, met with the bank's fraud division in person, and handed over every document, every signature comparison, every recording. The man across the desk went pale as he read. When he finished, he said they'd freeze the refinance account immediately. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out without looking back. That same afternoon, Rachel's world began to collapse. The funds were frozen, the loan flagged, and Caleb's co-ownership invalidated. She must have found out quickly because my phone started lighting up with messages, first pleading, then angry, then desperate. I read every one, then deleted them all. By evening, she left a voicemail, her voice breaking. She said the bank had called, that there was a misunderstanding, and she needed to meet. I didn't respond. Silence again, the kind that cuts deeper than any words. James called later to confirm what I already expected. The FBI had been notified. Cross-state financial fraud involving a VA-backed loan was federal territory. They were interested. Very interested. He asked me if I wanted to stay anonymous in the investigation. I told him yes, at least for now. She didn't need to know where the storm was coming from. That night, I checked the security cameras again. The same house where she'd made her grand announcement looked empty now. The curtains drawn, porch lights off. But at 11:47 p.m., headlights appeared in the driveway. Her car. She sat there for a few minutes, maybe working up the courage, then left without getting out. It was strange. For the first time in months, I almost felt sorry for her. But sympathy is a luxury you can't afford when you're this close to the end. Before going to bed, I opened my notebook and drew a single line through the final step of my plan. Response. Underneath, I wrote one more word, consequence. She'd spent months rewriting our life into her version of truth. Tomorrow, that story would be gone. Erased not by rage, but by record. And the next time she said my name, it wouldn't be in a yoga studio or on social media. It would be in a courtroom. The next morning, I woke to silence. No calls, no texts, no noise from the street. Just that heavy, expectant stillness before a storm breaks. Around 10, James called. His tone was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of satisfaction in his voice. He said the FBI had moved fast. Caleb and his business partner, the broker named Spencer, were already under investigation. They'd uncovered at least 6 similar cases involving military families. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was a pattern. I asked what would happen next. He said the agents would need my statement, the evidence, and that once charges were filed, the press might get involved. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just stared at the sunlight hitting the floor, the same floor Rachel had chosen when we renovated the house, and realized I felt nothing. Not relief. Not joy. Just quiet completion. Around noon, she finally showed up. I saw her car through the window, parking halfway down the street, like she couldn't bring herself to pull into the driveway. She stood outside for a while, talking on her phone, probably Caleb, maybe a lawyer, and then walked up to the door. I didn't open it. She rang once, twice, then knocked. Her voice was soft, uncertain. She said we needed to talk, that there were serious misunderstandings. I stayed still, let her talk to the empty house. After a few minutes, she left. I watched her walk down the street, small and nervous, nothing like the woman who'd stood in my backyard weeks ago, announcing her new life with pride. That night, James sent me an update. Caleb had been arrested on charges of identity theft and fraud. Spencer too. The FBI wanted to question Rachel, but they needed more evidence of her direct involvement before issuing a warrant. I asked if my silence still helped the case. He said it did. Letting her panic would lead to mistakes, and mistakes would finish the job. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. The quiet didn't bother me anymore. It felt earned. Clean. The kind of silence that comes after the noise is finally done. And somewhere out there, Rachel was learning what it meant to lose control, not from chaos, but from calm. 3 days later, everything accelerated. James called early, his voice clipped but controlled. He said the FBI had enough to move forward. Recorded calls, bank transfers, and Caleb's confession. Under pressure, he'd given them names, including Rachel's. She wasn't just collateral anymore. She was a suspect. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. I knew how it would unfold. They'd question her. She'd deny everything. Then the documents, signatures, and recordings would crush whatever story she tried to build. And I'd never have to raise my voice. Not once. That afternoon, she came back to the house. This time, she didn't knock. She used her old key and walked straight in, her face pale, eyes wide. She said she'd gotten a call from the bank, another from an investigator. She wanted to know what I'd done. I said nothing. I just watched her realize that silence was an answer. She asked if I hated her. I told her hate requires energy, and she'd taken enough of that already. Then she started crying. Real tears this time. The kind that come when a person understands too late that the damage is permanent. She tried to say Caleb had lied to her, that she didn't know about the refinance, that she'd been manipulated. I listened without expression, just like I had at the party. When she finished, I told her the truth, that I'd known about everything before she stood up in front of our friends and announced she was leaving. That I'd let her have her moment because I wanted her to believe she'd won. She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Then I opened the folder on the table, the legal agreements, the frozen assets, the police reports. I didn't hand them to her. I just let her look. Her face went white. She whispered something I couldn't hear, then ran out of the house, barefoot, shaking. I didn't follow. James called later that evening. The FBI had made their move. Caleb and his partner were already in custody, and Rachel had been called in for questioning. I asked what would happen to her. He said it depended on her cooperation. I hung up and sat quietly in the living room, the same place she'd once filled with noise and perfume and small lies. The house felt lighter now, almost peaceful. The storm had passed, but the aftershock, the silence she left behind, was its own kind of justice. The day the case went public, I was already gone from Denver. I'd taken a few days off work, packed light, and driven north toward Montana. Somewhere quiet, somewhere without memories. James called that morning to tell me it was official. Caleb had accepted a plea deal, 12 years for fraud and conspiracy. Spencer got 10. Rachel had avoided prison by cooperating, signing over every asset she still had, and confessing to the forged documents. Her reputation, her job, her circle of friends, gone. James said the authorities were impressed with how organized my documentation had been. They called it instrumental. I called it preparation. After we hung up, I sat in my truck for a long time, parked by a lake. The surface of the water was perfectly still. I thought about the night of the graduation party, her smile, her toast, the shock in everyone's faces when she declared her freedom. Back then, she believed she'd humiliated me. In truth, she'd freed me. I didn't feel triumph, just finality, a quiet ending to a story that had burned itself out. Ethan came to visit a month later, during his break before college. He'd heard pieces of the story from friends, but I told him the rest in simple terms. That his mother had made mistakes, that people sometimes lose themselves chasing something that isn't real. He listened quietly, then said he was proud of how I handled it. That meant more than anything. We spent a few days fishing, walking, not saying much. Sometimes silence says what words can't. When he left, I bought a small cabin nearby, a place with wide skies and no neighbors for miles. I rebuilt my life the same way I dismantled the old one, patiently, deliberately, with no noise. Every so often, Rachel sends a message. Short ones. Apologies. Reflections. I never respond. She had her chance to speak. Now the quiet belongs to me. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, I poured a glass of whiskey and stood on the porch. I thought about everything she'd taken, everything I'd lost, and how strangely complete it all felt. Some men fight back loud. Some rebuild in silence. I chose silence. And in the end, it spoke louder than she ever could. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.